what it does mean is that we should see very clearly and with a very penetrating wisdom the impermanent transitory nature of it all. So we can really ask ourselves the question in our practice and in our lives, how much of our life do we want to invest in the fulfillment of these desires? And how big a part of our life do we want to spend in doing this? At one time, I was on retreat, and I was sitting, and I was just going through this run of thoughts, that I was really getting into. I was just enjoying. Now I can't even remember what they were about, but and at a certain point, I just gave myself a talking to. And I said, do you want to think, do you want to be free? Right? And it just kind of crystallized the choices, that I was making. It's not that thoughts stopped coming, but it weakened that sense of indulgence. Oh yeah, just let me go into this one for a little bit. When we see clearly what's happening, that really gives us the space of choice. If we don't see what's happening, then we're just acting out all the old habits of our conditioning. So desire for sense pleasures in all the ways, whether it's the physical sense pleasures, whether it's the expectation in practice, whether it's diversion, whether it's great passion, whether it's addictions, whatever it is, desire for sense pleasures, one kind or another. This is the first kind of craving. The second kind of craving the Buddha talked about was craving for rebirth, particularly heavenly rebirth. The Buddha talked a lot about the heaven realms, and he talked about it by way of delighting the mind, and creating a sense of joy, creating a sense of happiness. And the descriptions are wonderful. When I first went to India and practiced with Munindraji, he would spend a lot of time talking about these Deva realms, and beings born with bodies of light, and everything beautiful, and they're born around age 16 or 17, they appear spontaneously. They're just ready to enjoy things. A description of these pleasure groves and heavenly musicians, and it's like complete delight on every side. There are even heavenly meditation halls, where we, in our bodies of light, can sit and practice. And it's said that Maitreya, the coming Buddha, is now residing in one of these heaven realms, Tusita realm, actually teaching the Dharma. In all of the Buddhist traditions, there are these descriptions of these realms from people who have experienced them in one way or another. Now, as Westerners, I think we tend to have some skepticism about it all. And it reminds me of a comment that Munindra used to make as he would be going on and on about these heaven realms and seeing looks of, if not disbelief, questioning, among the Westerners. He would go on very enthusiastic and excited. You don't have to believe this. You don't have to believe it. It's true, but you don't have to believe it. And then he would proceed to go on. So on the one hand, sort of the talk or the thought or the reflection of the Deva realms really do create a brightness in the mind. And if we can open to the possibility of real delight. On the other hand, this kind of desire also is a trap. And it's like the bee buzzing around in the jar thinking, oh, maybe I'll buzz on up to the top for a while, the top of the jar, see what's doing up there. You know, it can go to the top, it can go to the bottom, it's still caught in the jar. With the desire for rebirth, or even heavenly rebirth, or heavenly pleasures, heavenly delights, or if you don't so much connect with that possibility, you can think of it in terms of desire for heavenly states of mind, heavenly meditative experiences. You know, wanting that kind of experience. It's still being trapped in the jar. It's still being trapped in this cycle of birth and death. And that's why the Buddha talked about this as the second and very important kind of craving, of desire to see in ourselves. Are we after something? Are we after rebirth, whether it's next life or next sitting or tomorrow? Are we after a rebirth in some realm, in some happy realm? We need to see that, and that can very much condition how we practice. Are you practicing in order to have some experience? That's a kind of craving. It's a kind of desire. And what it's doing, in a way that may not be noticed, is that it's strengthening the sense of self. It's strengthening that sense of I who wants something. And that's precisely what keeps us bound. In the same way, the third kind of desire for no rebirth does exactly the same thing. This is the annihilationist view. We're thinking that it's all over, or we want it to be all over. This also is predicated on the view of self. The idea that there's someone there not to be reborn. This matter is at the heart of suffering and freedom. So it's really important to begin to see how it's operating in our own minds, in our own experience. The great discovery in practice, really the great awakening, the great illumination, is that there is no one there to either be reborn or not to be reborn. That the very notion of self, the very idea of self, the very concept of self is an illusion. And it's only the ignorance of this, the fact that we don't see it, and the desires which keep coming out of this ignorance, that keeps us revolving, you know, in samsara, on this cycle of birth and death. And you can think of it over lifetimes, you can think of it over a single lifetime, you can think of it in a single sitting. There's a writer named Wei Wu Wei. He's actually an Englishman, lived in China, in Hong Kong. Very, very wonderful writer. About this whole notion of the desires coming out of the sense of self, coming out of that ignorance. Whether it's desire for sense pleasure, desire for rebirth, desire for not rebirth. All of it, he said, is like a dog barking up a tree that isn't there. That's what we're doing. We're barking up this tree of self, and it's not there. So how can we use the time of the retreat, and particularly a retreat like this, where there's enough time to really go quite deeply into these matters? Now we can look with very great precision and exactitude in order to understand how desire, in all of these manifestations, how this energy, how this force is working, is conditioning our lives, conditioning our suffering. Most importantly, the most important way of being with it is to be aware when it arises. Because mostly we're not. As I said, it's become so much a part of who we are. It's usually invisible to us. So as you're going through the day, you really want to keep an eye out. Keep the awareness open so that you see desire as it arises. Recognize the wanting mind. Whatever the wanting is for. You know, it's some fantasy, it's wanting diversion, it's wanting some meditative state, whatever. Really pay attention to those moments of the mind wanting, desiring, of craving. Not with a sense of judgment. Not with a sense, oh, this is bad, I shouldn't be feeling this. Not at all. It's almost a sense of welcoming it, because it's a chance to understand it. You know, this is a great laboratory for you. You can really look and see, how is this working in my mind and in my life? Notice the many times a day that it arises. You're not going to have to wait long, you know. Just little things, just little moments of wanting. You hear a sound, and if you're really attentive, maybe you'll notice just that moment of wanting to turn to see what it is. Just that, something as simple as that. The head by itself doesn't turn. There's a whole process involved. What is that wanting? What is that desire? Can you see it? Notice all of these little moments, and sometimes there'll be big moments, which take you away from the simplicity of simply knowing. The nature of the mind is awareness. It's open, it's lucid, it's clear, it's unobstructed. There's great simplicity in that. It's desire which obscures that simplicity. So we want to see for ourselves how it's happening. So that it's no longer theoretical. We grok it. Keep in mind that desire is not the problem. It's the identification with the desire. It's the being lost in the desire. It's not knowing that it's present. That's where the problem is. As you notice these desires arising in the mind, these moments of wanting, see if you can discern how the identification with that desire in a moment actually solidifies a sense of self. You can feel it. You can feel the contraction of energy. When we get identified with a wanting, the wanting itself is fine. When we get identified with it, in that moment you can feel it's like the contraction of self has been created. So this is very interesting, just to look, to see. So that's one way of really beginning to work with desire. Another way is by investigating and exploring the joy of renunciation. Now, for some people, that phrase, I don't know if I'm using this word right, is an oxymoron. But joy of renunciation. That can't be. Because many of us have been conditioned to think of renunciation as a great burden. There's a great line from St. Augustine where he's praying to God and he says, "Dear Lord, make me chaste, but not yet." Right? And that's generally our spirit of thinking about renunciation. Yeah, it's good for me, but not quite yet. Or else we do something. We actually have this act of renunciation, sort of like eating beets as a kid. Well, I don't really like it, but it'll be good for me. So very often that's our conditioned way of thinking about renunciation. But we can begin to see it in a completely different way. And it's in a way that really liberates our minds. And that is, we begin to see that addiction is the burden, and that letting go is the freedom. There's one or two examples of this. Just imagine, you're sitting, not now of course, but before you came here. You're sitting watching TV, and there are these endless commercials. Just imagine what it would be like if you wanted everything that was advertised. It would be a hell of a... No, it would. If everything that were advertised, I want that, I want that, I want that, I want that. But fortunately, we've been deconditioned with regard to the advertisements on TV to a large extent. Most of us mute them. So we've learned it about TV, but we haven't really learned it about the commercials in our minds. All the desires that come up, it's the same principle though. To want everything, that presents itself as an object of desire. I want this, I want this, I want that. There's a tremendous suffering in that addiction, and there's tremendous ease in being able to let them go. Renunciation is not the burden, it's the wanting that's the burden. So if we see this, if we have a taste of that, it actually reinforces our ability just to let things pass through. I had another experience of this in practice on retreat. I was sitting and things were going along quite well. Things were just rolling along smoothly. And I had this image that I was just on this highway, the freeway, the Mass Pike. And I'd be going along, coasting, cruising along, and then there'd be this big billboard on the side of the road. Oh, amusement park, take this exit, whatever our particular amusement park is. And I could just see my mind, I was watching my mind, see this big billboard. Oh, I'll go visit that. And it's like I would get off the exit, and down the road and play a little while and whatever it was. And then I just have to come back and get back on the freeway. Well, as I noticed this over time, I began to get a little better at actually seeing the billboard. Oh yeah, that's a billboard. But still the tendency was quite strong. And I find myself still getting off the exit, but not actually going all the way down the road. I'd get off the exit, and I'd see it, and I'd get right back on. After going through this a number of times, my mind wised up a little bit. I saw the billboard, and I realized I didn't even have to get off the exit. Okay, there's this billboard. I'll do this, go here, enjoy this. I could just see that billboard and stay cruising on the highway. We can change our relationship to this proliferation of desire that arises in the mind. It's not that they're going to stop coming, but we don't have to buy in. We don't have to get off the exit each time. It comes through awareness. It comes through seeing. look carefully at times when desire is present and when you're caught in it. Whatever it is, to desire for something or lost in a fantasy, whatever. Really pay careful attention to the experience of being lost and then how it feels when we wake up, when we come out of it. Just notice the difference in your experience. And I think you'll notice that there is a sense of great relief. It's like being let out of the grip of something. Even if the desire was pleasant, even if there was a certain enjoyment to it, compared to the letting go, there's a tightness, there's a tension, there's a bondage. And you can see that clearly if you watch that transition moment. You're in something, you're in it, and then in a certain moment, and it's just like being let out of the grip of wanting. So pay attention to that. So you really know for yourself from the inside, this desire, this wanting, this craving is suffering. And we don't have to keep buying into it. One of the great liberating insights around desire that comes from being on retreat, where there's not that much opportunity to fulfill a great many of them, is the insight, the understanding that desires do not have to be fulfilled to go away. And mostly in our lives, that's the assumption. We're filled with some strong desire for something. If I don't do it, if I don't get it, if I don't have it, it's going to be gnawing at me. So I have to fulfill it in order to come to peace. One of the things that we see so clearly on retreat, just through the power of awareness, of being settled back, watching it all come and go. The desire is there, it's there, it's there, it's there, it's there, and then it's not there. That is a tremendous insight. We realize we don't have to do anything about them. We don't have to act on them. It gives us the space in our lives then to make some wise choices. There's one more little piece about desire I want to mention. And this gets into sort of a more subtle level of understanding why it's such a strong force in our lives and why it's so difficult for us to get a handle on it. One of the things that we can begin to notice is that it's not actually the object or the experience that we have the desire for. It looks like that. On the surface, it seems like that. But really what the desire is for the pleasant feeling that we anticipate getting with that experience or that object. Do you see the difference? Because there's quite an amazing freedom which comes from understanding this distinction. Usually we think that what we want is the object. But really what we want is the pleasant feeling that we think is going to come with that experience. How is this freeing to seeing this? And I've noticed this as I've watched desire in my own mind and how I get caught again and again. And I've done this with little things. We don't have to be talking about grand passions here. We can be talking just about the ordinary, commonplace movement of wanting in the mind. I find myself justifying the wanting mind by the thought, well, I'm not really attached to this cup of tea. You know, there's a wanting the cup of tea, and I think, I'm not really attached to it. And so then, just go ahead and do it. Because I'm not really attached to it. Or I'm not really attached to looking at the bulletin board for the 1,000th time. And I'm not. And so, go ahead and do it. It's precisely because that statement is true that we miss what's underneath it. It is true. I'm not attached to that cup of tea. And I'm not attached to looking at the bulletin board. And I'm not attached to whatever particular thing it is. Because that's true, I'm overlooking the more subtle attachment to the pleasant feeling that I think will be there in that experience. And when I reflect on that, I see, yes, that's what's propelling the movement. I am attached. I am wanting that pleasant feeling. Seeing this difference for me has been very helpful, because I begin to see accurately the pattern or the forces, the way the conditioning is playing itself out. And when I realize before doing something, yeah, it's not the object. I'm not attached particularly to that. But when I see, oh yeah, there's this wanting for the pleasant feeling, when I recognize that, along with that very often comes the understanding, that feeling is really, there's not much there, you know? When my mind is really focused on what really is happening, I say, it's not worth the effort just for those few moments of pleasant feeling. And so there's a lot more freedom in the mind. Again, it's not that we never have the cup of tea, or that we never do whatever it is. But can we do it from a place of discriminating wisdom? From really seeing what's going on, rather than from blindly acting out this very deep pattern. You know, Vipassana means seeing clearly. And Krishnamurti expressed this very beautifully. He said, it's the truth which liberates, not our efforts to be free. That's what we're doing here. It's really investigating deeply enough so that we see how these forces of bondage are working in our minds, in our lives. I think the great gift and power and beauty of the retreat, especially this one, is that it gives you enough time to settle in, to concentrate the mind, and to look deeply. And to look deeply from a place of interest, of wanting to discover the mystery of all this. How we get so entangled, how we can become free in this. Learning about desire on retreat, seeing it clearly, begins to free us in the face of desire in our lives outside. We know when to act on it, when to let go. The mind is clear. The mind is unobstructed. The mind is lucid. The mind is open. The mind is empty. Desire comes as a visitor. It's not in the nature of the mind itself. It comes as a visitor when conditions are there. When it comes, we want to see. We want to see deeply into it. The other night, Michelle, or